I'm lucky enough to work with something like 50 different radio stations in more than 10 different countries as a consultant. So I thought, first, let's talk about what a consultant really does. That's how you say it. It's a noun. The official definition is a person who gives professional or expert advice, a consultant on business methods. So I'm somebody who consults somebody or something. Ask my children, they come up with a slightly different definition. What they say I do is a person who listens to music and goes for lunch. And sometimes tells people what to do. Of course, the other definition is somebody who borrows your watch to tell you the time. Well, what I've tried to do with this session is distill a lot of learning from a lot of different markets, from the Far East, the Middle East, to mainland Europe, to Scandinavia and the UK, and try and find some principles that work for you, whether you're a programmer, whether you're a producer, or whether you're a presenter. And I wanted to start with a thought for all of the left-brainers in here. The chief enemy of creativity is common sense. Now, a lot of my job is asking very simple, very naive questions. The kind of questions that very often common sense would tell you not even to dare to ask. When I'm asking them, I often think, well, people will all know the answer to this because it's so basic. And very often people don't know the answers to those questions. In meetings, if you can imagine, I'm sitting in a meeting in the Middle East. I am the least expert person in the room. I don't know as much about the market. I don't know as much about the listeners. I don't know as much about the radio station. I don't know as much about the marketing as all the other people there. So I have to ask questions. And I would just say this. If you sit in a meeting, if something doesn't make sense to you, when somebody is explaining something, ask questions. You know, somebody far smarter than me said, seek first to understand. And never be shy about keeping asking questions until you do understand. Because if you don't understand, life's miserable and life's hard. And that's true whether it's how you construct a link or how you build a strategy. When I'm analysing a radio station in a new market, this is often the way we look at it. So first of all, there is a pink arrow behind there somewhere. First of all, it's really important to understand the market. Just what environment are you operating in? What's the regulation framework? Who are the competitors? What are the essentials that you have to include and so on? Listener insight. Who are you talking to? What does she or he talk about, care about? Brand design. What does the radio station stand for? We'll talk about all of these in a bit more detail a little later in the presentation. But if your management or you aren't clear about the brand, then you need to do some work. Because in a busy, over-communicated world, the brand is only going to become more and more important. Product development. What are the priorities in terms of what comes out of the speakers? If you don't know, ask, because you need to know. And then in terms of promotional activity, what are they trying to achieve? Normally, marketing's trying to do one of three things. Drive more listeners, drive more listening, that's Q, more TSL, or else drive an image. Make people think something different about your radio station. But whatever you do on the radio station, whether you're on air or whether you're a producer, it's really very important that you understand the strategy. If you don't understand the strategy, and this seems to be true all around the world, then no matter how hard you try, at least half the time, you'll be swimming in the wrong direction. So let's talk about each of those little boxes in turn. Let's talk first about making sense of the market. You know, I have seen good radio stations beaten by bad radio stations many times. Being good is a great place to start, but that's not the end of the journey. I mean, in marketing speak, people choose a product or service because of how it's different, not because of how it's the same. I think programmers, if you're a program controller or a program director, you obviously need to understand every radio station in the market. You need to understand what drives them, what's weak about them, what your audience thinks about them. If you're a producer or a presenter, I would say you need to really understand how your show is different and how it's better than the other shows in the market. Now, one show might be doing lots of interviews, you might be playing a lot of music. One might be more cerebral, one might be more fun. Doesn't matter. But you do need to understand, because from a listener's point of view, they're making an active choice. Do I listen to this, or do I listen to this? And if you can put yourself in their shoes, it makes designing your show, running your show, so much easier. The other thing, I will talk about this later, personality. You know, when people talk about personality, often they end up thinking about Chris Moyles, and we'll talk about him later too. But real radio personality isn't somebody who talks a lot, it's somebody who says a lot. And personality gets injected into everything. You know, I have these conversations all around the world. Don't read me the weather, just tell me. Don't read it because it's on the script. Tell me because I need to decide what to wear to work today. The difference between reading and telling or talking is the difference between a robo-jock and a real person on the radio. So when you're thinking about the most mechanical bits of your show, pre-promoting the news, selling the music, really think about how you can invest something of yourself into that bit of the show. Love the listener. You've really got to know your listener. Have you been in those conversations where two presenters or a presenter and a programmer are talking and they're just slagging the listener off? As though they've got some kind of mental abnormality and they shouldn't really be listening to the radio station because it's a bit crap? I would really encourage you to respect the listener, as we heard in the last session. Learn to like them, learn to love them. Not only do they earn you a living, but they choose your radio station. And I think they deserve to be treated with respect. Don't be rude, don't be offensive about them, but do get to know them. You need to know a lot about the listeners because they affect everything you do. If you imagine the way you talk to your gran, your mum, or your children, if you have them, it's still you, but you talk in a completely different way. So if you know who you're talking to, if you're talking to her, you will talk. Your language, your vocabulary, your performance, your content, your topics will all be different. Because I work so much internationally, one of the things we talk a lot about is the listener. This is working in southern India a few months ago, because quite often the presenters and the producers don't know what make the listeners tick until I start asking questions. The obvious stuff, what time do people get up? You'd be surprised sometimes in some parts of the world the working day starts at 7. How long do people take to get up? How do they get to work? As a consultant, obviously, that's very important for me, but also for you. What time does that listener do different things? We run a lot of workshops, really trying to get to the bottom of who we're talking to, how they behave. And of course, there's a risk that we're dealing with generalizations, but there are also patterns of behavior that are common to many of us when it comes to the way we live our lives. And it is affected by your life stage. On a programming, on a production level, if you're a presenter and you move to a new area, you have to learn the patch. You know, you drive around in the rush hour, you go to football, you go to shopping centres, you really try and understand how people live their lives. I would say, as somebody who was once moved from an overnight show, they were desperate, to a mid-morning show. Now, my life stage up to that point, I was a bit younger, a bit more rock and roll. I'd do the show kind of 1 till 4 in the morning. I'd go and get the papers for the breakfast jock. I'd then go and have a few beers, watch a bit of television, get to bed about 8, 9 o'clock in the morning, sleep till 3 or 4, wake up, have a bit of breakfast, go and see my mates till 11, then go to work and prepare the show. So when I got given middays or mid-mornings, I honestly didn't know what mid-mornings were about. I'd slept through the previous 2 years of them. And that might be slightly extreme, but if you move shift, if you take on a different day part, you have to think about your listeners because people do different things at different times. It's obvious and it's important, but you need to know about more than just their behaviours and their attitudes. Behaviours and attitudes are a great way to start thinking about your listeners. Where are they? What are they doing? What they might like to hear. But you also need to know about this other stuff, about their aspirations. What do they dream about? What do they think about? What do they wish for in their lives? Values, what's important to them? That changes as people go through different life stages. It changes for men and for women. Beliefs. Beliefs are a big deal because they're obviously the things that people don't even think about. They're the kind of values that people have so internalized, they're just part of the way they see the world. An identity. How do they see themselves? If you can key into people, obviously everybody's an individual, but, and I'm talking here about a typical listener. this is a useful tool even if it's built on generalizations. From a promotions and a marketing point of view, it's also important. The behavior, the environment, the where and the what are one part of the conversation, but in practical terms, that's the product conversation. That's the day-to-day doing. If you want to build a deeper relationship with your listeners, you need to understand this other stuff. That's the brand conversation. That's the bit where you have the emotional engagement. If you can speak to people about more than just what they do and where they are, if you can let everything else you know about them inform how you speak, you will build a stronger brand, you will build stronger emotional engagement. Of course, the truth is, for us, unlike many other products, 80% of the brand experience is the product experience. What you choose to say, do, and put on the radio has a profound on the way the listeners think and feel about you. I mean, it's blindingly obvious until you think about something like Pepsi or Coke, well-worn examples, but what are Pepsi and Coke? Well, they're sticky, brown, sweet liquids. All of that other stuff that they do is nothing to do with the product. It's all to do with the brand. And I reckon everybody in this room has a very clear opinion whether they prefer Pepsi or whether they prefer Coke. In detailed tests, they discover Pepsi listeners typically like a very slightly sweeter drink, and most people in the blind taste test choose Pepsi. The problem with it being very sweet is if you drink too much of it, it becomes a bit sickly more quickly than Coke. That's all about sticky brown liquid, fizzy liquid, but nothing to do with the brand. And the brand is very important. As a programmer, marketeer, salesperson, producer, presenter, if you understand your radio station's brand and your own, then you'll know where the brand boundaries are. If you want your radio station to be more than just a utility, more than just water that comes out of the tap, then you have to build listener loyalty. And you do that by connecting with them. And I only came across this recently. I thought, what a great point. You don't control the brand. We don't own the brand. The brand lives in the listeners. Now, we talk, we behave, we do things in a certain way to try and help people feel a certain way about the presenter or about the radio station. But ultimately, the brand is theirs. It's their emotional engagement with you. It's not something that you have and can dissect and put back together again. Typically, radio stations want more listeners to listen longer. They're trying to get the radio listeners to love the radio station more. So if you know what the brand stands for, then you can start saying, is what I'm doing right? Does it fit? Does it help or does it hinder the strategy? And of course, the problem with that is the old hippie saying, if you're not part of the solution, then your program director is going to be on your back fairly quickly. So, ultimately, it comes down to this. If you don't know the strategy, if you don't understand the brand, then how do you judge what you're doing, apart from waiting for somebody else to tell you? From a practical point of view, I think you should be constantly checking that you're saying and doing the right things in the right way with the right people. Not over-analytical. In your preparation and your planning, you need to think hard about the content in the treatment to make sure it all fits strategically. In the performance, you then let it play, you let it fly. You make sure that whatever your content is, that your content, your treatment, and your performance fits you, fits the listener, and fits the radio station. Talking about content, treatment, and performance, I wanted to just show you a visual example. This is the radio station I work with in Slovakia. This says More Music, Less Talk. They're called Jenne Melodia. The challenge was to develop the radio station to make it more attractive to a younger audience. Their problem was the product was right. It's a soft AC, great radio station. The difficulty was the audience, the younger audience, didn't really know it. So how do you take a radio station that looks like this and make it feel younger and more contemporary? You do something like that. Still a classic font, but lowercase, crowdsourced, Facebook-sourced backgrounds, white out of colours, much more contemporary. Without even changing anything on the radio station, we started to change the way people feel about it. And that's what you do when you change the treatment and the performance in what you do. And the basics are still the basics. Mornings, music, marketing are still the three most important things for most music radio stations. Let's take a look at those in more detail. First of all, let's talk about Kid Craddock. Now, he's been doing radio since he was 18. He's now 53. He does a 5-hour morning show, 5 till 10, syndicated on more than 75 radio stations. And he says this: you should do the following. 1 thing per quarter hour that commands respect, 1 thing per hour that causes a response, 1 thing a day that is shareable, 1 thing per quarter that listeners remember, and 1 thing a year that makes you legendary. Great advice from somebody who's been doing it for a very long time. Chris Moyles. Not everyone's a fan. A lot of people like him now, he's gone. Undeniable success on Radio 1, biggest serving breakfast show presenter, 8 million listeners, a master on the radio. One of the things that made him so good was he was real. He wasn't always fluent, he wasn't always articulate, sometimes he wasn't even likable. But he's a presenter who sounds real, and in a world of fakery and spin, that real emotional connection counts for a lot. Whether you're on a national radio morning show, on a weekend show, or an overnight show, you need to think about what you're doing. Is everything you do interesting, entertaining, or useful? Are you talking to people's heads, their hearts, or their hands? Is your listener in your thinking when you're designing, planning, and delivering your content? Listeners will judge you and choose you if you really engage with them. Right. I work in Sweden with a rock station. We seriously had the meeting about whether you could play Iron Maiden, Bring Your Daughter to the Slaughter in the breakfast show. The answer is you can. Listeners love music, and as presenters we sometimes forget that. Every time somebody crashes a vocal, fades the song halfway through, does a bad edit, treats the song with contempt, fails to enjoy it, fails to show they've enjoyed it, they're undermining not only their own show, but also the radio station and the listener. Finally, let's talk for a moment about marketing. If I give you a sweet and say, try that, you'll try it. If you don't like it, how hard do I have to try to get you to try it a second time? 4 times as hard? Because your immediate response is, no thanks, I don't like it. If I can persuade you to try it a second time and you still don't like it, how hard do I have to try to get you to have it a third time? Radio stations and presenters over and over again promote things when they're not ready. Radio stations market themselves out of trouble. And what does that do? Somebody tries it, it drives the ratings up short term, and then people discover they don't like it, and it's twice as hard to get them tried again. Totally unscientific, but I think it's true. Finally, let's just talk a little bit about making some noise. When your product is right, when you're happy with the show, when you're happy with the radio station, make some noise. Isn't that a great vehicle? That's the same rock station that plays Bring Your Daughter to the Slaughter. In Berlin, we had a problem with outdoor. It was too expensive. We were giving away cars. We gave away a car a day for a month. So we put them on a whacking great lorry and drove it around the streets all day. That's great if you've got a budget. If you haven't, you can still make some noise. You can do it with Facebook and Twitter. This is a Dave Ryan show. You come across this in Minneapolis? They did a bit about a mum who left her 4-year-old in the car when she went to buy some spirits and a lottery ticket. They came up with other white trash people problems. Personally, I don't love the topic, but they, within 45 minutes, were the #1 Twitter trend in the US, #2 in the world. You've got that at your disposal. You've just got to figure out what to do with it and program Facebook and Twitter. Finally, I think the world's had enough of full frontal radio. What is it that possesses morning shows especially to want to take off their clothes? I don't get it, but honestly, it puts most of us off our breakfast. It makes the whole thing about you rather than the listener, and unless you're totally toned and gorgeous, it tells most people why you're on radio, not on TV. Thank you very much.
I can't believe that we've been here for about 2.5, 3 hours, and we've talked about 12 or 13 completely distinct things. The format is great, and I'm just really pleased with it. It hammers through loads of different things. You can barely keep up. It's a bit relentless, but in a good way.
It's been a great day. Lots of good people to talk to, lots of good people to listen to, and learn lots of good things.